be right under these conditions. Perhaps laboratory testing was done, but not necessarily under those conditions, like out on Dogger Bank or wherever else it might be. So, which is where most people actually encounter risks and have to handle them. So, these are really quite realist, imbued and inspired questions. And I've been trying to do it ever since, and I've continued in domains like, more recently, European policy making and indeed global risks on GM crops and foods, and so on. So, Ditte's thesis was actually very interesting to me, and I was really grateful to have the opportunity to read it. I enjoyed it very much. It's actually very well written. There's a very good story in it, so I'm recommending it to you all to read it here. And of course also, as a non-Danish language speaker, it's always a model to me to remind myself of just how lucky we mother tongue English speakers are, that most of the people in the world can actually do that kind of a job, not only in their own language, but also in English language too. So thank you all for listening to me in English. And thank you, Ditte. I mean, written and presented in English too. If I was speaking in Danish, I'd have finished about 10 minutes ago. Ditte, thanks very much. I really enjoyed reading it, as I've said, and I learnt a lot from it as well. We shared various questions and issues, the three examiners on the panel, over the last month or more in first receiving and reading it, and formulated the report. And we've discussed this morning how to carve up the process, and I think Søren, as president, indicated that we were going to try, rather than just take half an hour each, that we'd actually attempt to follow our lines of questioning in a thematic way, so to combine in a flexible manner. And this, we have to confess, is itself an experiment, a rather public one here in front of me. So under Susa's chairmanship, we have to see how this goes. So we'll pass the word back and forth a bit, with our eye on the clock, of course, and with plenty of time for Ditte to actually address our questions and see where we go from there. So I guess the first question that I had for you, Ditte, and I think actually Hans had similar questions, of a historical kind really. So I want to come back to what you say in the thesis about boundary definition between science and policy, and also, of course, physically, boundary definition of special area conservation, the legal definition of the areas of interest, the designated sites on Dogger Bank. Boundaries there too, and boundary definition. And it was an interesting confusion for me on first picking up and reading the thesis, that I was getting two different kinds of boundary definition as problems in the thesis itself. One being science and policy boundaries, the other being geographical, physical boundaries on Dogger Bank. I eventually sorted that out. Took me a while. But there's an interesting question which you've been alerted to, so I want to just invite you to elaborate a bit more on it, which is that the Habitats Directive, like a lot of other European environmental policy, makes assumptions which relate directly then to procedures and decision-making processes and advisory processes, that the policy terms, the legal terms, having legal standing in the European policies like the Habitats Directive, the Birds Directive and many others, can be defined in purely scientific terms. Not just that they can be defined in scientific terms, but purely and only scientific terms. And that's a really important question which anybody with political or sociological imagination of an everyday common sense kind would scratch their heads and ask, how on earth did they ever start from there? What kind of a starting point is that they would assume that such terms as a sandbank slightly covered all of the time, deliciously ambiguous, beautifully ambiguous term, that could only ever be defined in purely scientific ways. So there's a history to this which you haven't really described or discussed in the thesis, and I just wondered whether you would like to elaborate more on where does this come from and what's it doing, this kind of mythology, if you like, of scientism, that environmental policy could be defined only in scientific terms in that way. Granted, scientific knowledge is very important in this process.
Yeah. I don't know how much I'll be able to talk about historical development, but in the EU, it is a major issue how to ensure even implementation in the different member states, and also how to ensure enforcement, to have some kind of way of assessing whether the member states have implemented European policies. So science plays an important role here, for example, in relation to indicators. So it's become a tool, an implementation tool, you could say, which is why it is brought into these.
There's a logic of consistency required, I guess. Science could be principled.
Yeah, exactly. So it's an expectation that by applying scientific measures, it will be implemented evenly, and that it will ensure it will be a way of translating policies to national settings. So it's kind of, it's because of the way science is being used as a tool and such in the EU, because of the problems which EU is juggling with.
I'm not sure to raise it now, but there is a place in the thesis. Have you got a copy of that? Maybe I should. If we look at page 1, let's look at the.
Oh, okay.
I wanted you to have it as well. You remember you wrote this.
You wrote it, right?
On page 166. Where you're discussing Latour and his idea of the great divide between nature and society, which is continually repurified in, under the modern constitution, as he calls it, that we're forever entangling ourselves actually in all kinds of complex hybrids between nature and the human. But then we are always busy trying to pretend that we've actually got them pure nature over there, society over here, and the human, and so on. So you say, if I could just quote for everyone else's benefit, as to underline the constitutional element of Latour's great divide between nature and society, purification, that is purification into nature and society as separate, is simply a legal requirement. Now, purification is a legal requirement, as we just discussed in the Habitats Directive, as you described in the thesis. But whether it's simply a legal requirement is another question.
Yeah.
And you've actually also described in the thesis that purification is part of the politics and sociology of attempting authority generation. In other words, it's actually by defining policies and practices as if they're only scientifically derived that they can capture or gain authority.
Yeah.
So I'm just wanting you to really elaborates on the purification there. Is it simply a legal requirement, as it is in the directive, or is there more to it than that?
Try if I understand you correctly. Well, it's maybe the word simply it's an unlucky formulation, because there's a lot to it, of course. I think what I meant there is that it is active people. I mean, they can be taken to the European court if they don't do this in a purely scientific manner, at which they are actually hearing of the UK. So that's what I meant with simple. But it could make it sound like I imply that there's no more to it. But science is used in different ways. I mean, in EU and in relations, implementations, and so on. And it's not necessarily. Well, I mean, it's used as a political tool. So I mean, it's not like, I mean, it's brought into politics and it's made a mean of translating legal terms into, for example, concrete boundaries on the document. So in that way, it's enmeshed in.
I guess what I'm trying to explore there really, I mean, you've already stated, and quite rightly, that one of the reasons why we see this kind of scientific drive with European policy formation is precisely in order to try to generate consistency between different member states, 4 different ones of which impinge on the Dogger Bank physically. So the idea of a specifically European policy, a European Habitats Directive in this case, as distinct from one of the UK, German, a Dutch and a Danish one, is precisely because of the aspiration to have a European policy. So that there is an attempt built into the idea of having only scientific definition of such sites as legal entities, that there is a singular political entity called Europe, which is the subject, the actor of those policies. So that you're already saying that a bit more than that this is science being used as a political tool. It's more that science is a part of the very formation of political authority in particular forms, in this case in a European form. Then of course we've got the point that, well, there's still the UK and there's still Germany, there's still Denmark and the Netherlands actually, but you focus mainly on the UK and Germany. So the question when we get comparative, and I'll leave this on the shelf for now, we'll come back to it, is to what extent does the formation of authority in the German context and the UK context actually differ as a historical and a cultural political process? In which case it's a bit more than simply talking about science being used as a tool. As if somebody just pulls it out of their back pocket and uses it politically. See what I mean?
We're talking about the formation of scientific authority.
Political authority. But we'll maybe leave that now, because Hans had some historical questions.
Okay, perhaps I should just start by introducing myself. I will do it a little more briefly. My name is Hans Lassen. My background is as a scientific advisor to various groups, governments and so on, since about 88. So I have been through this process as a big player in various forms, mostly sitting in the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea, where we are advising on new policies. So, My first question is that on the same thing on coherence. I think there is a historical dimension that perhaps we could discuss a little bit more in continuation of what Brian had already said on the Habitats Directive. You are perfectly aware, I'm sure, that the Habitats Directive was made as a, let's say, last minute save for the EU to show something on the Rio Convention in '92 in order to have something to show for the Biodiversity Convention. And the background was mainly terrestrial and was, I think you are citing one of the UK scientific advisors, that it was just extrapolated a little bit into cultural models. Then there is a step which I think one could have explored a bit more, where you suddenly make a jump from essentially the Walton Sea, and suddenly you are in the middle of the North Sea on the Outer Bank. And that particular step is of course driven by a number of groups' interest, if you like. And I don't know if you have looked into that, but perhaps some reflection on what that step means, and that of course defines the starting point of in particular both the German and the UK process in around 2000. So there is an historical aspect that I don't want to know if you would like to comment or reflect on what had happened there, or
Yes.
what problems that created for the starting point of the process.
Yeah, I think we spoke a bit about that. It started with, I mean, to begin with, the Habitats Directive applied in territorial areas, which was on land, and then up to 12 nautical miles of the coast. But then there was a court case in the UK. It was Greenpeace who argued that the member states had, when they had exclusive rights in the exclusive economic zones, which is from 12 nautical miles to 200 nautical miles, they have exclusive rights to extract resources. And Greenpeace argued that then they should also have obligations to protect the environment. And it was a court case in the UK where they, which ended up with applying the UK to implement the Habitats Directive also in the exclusive economic zone. And then when it took a while before the UK started this work to implement the directive in the exclusive economic zone, and then the European Commission pushed for the implementation of and there was a European court case where it was kind of at a European level expressed that we could have obligations, which meant that now it also came to apply on the other member states to implement the Habitats Directive in the marine area. So suddenly the directive, which was developed to cover coastal areas and land, also had to cover the marine area, and there were a number of issues in relation to that, because the list of habitats and species had been developed for territorial areas and coastal areas, and there was only they identified 3 habitat types which they found occurred in offshore waters, and one of them was sandbanks, like we talked about. But there's been a lot of debates about how can you translate. I mean, it's a sandbank in the coastal area the same as offshore, for example, and wouldn't there be other habitat types which would be relevant to protect offshore, which have not been included in this list and so on. So the translation of the Habitats Directive to offshore waters has not been without tensions. And we see also these conflicts in the negotiations on the sandbank, on the definition of the sandbank habitat when they want to translate it to marine areas. And is that
what I'm really getting at is, I think in your thesis you quote one particular UK scientific advisor that the reason for concluding the sandbank was protection of eider ducks and other seabirds. And you extrapolate, and for that reason they define sandbanks, which you extrapolate to an area where there's no eider ducks. And that, I would suggest, create a credibility issue, credibilities in certain quarters, which means that the whole process is running into trouble at its very outset. And I don't know if you agree with that assessment, but if so, how did that influence, for example, the German process, which was the third one?
Well, that they have, the member states have been managing this transformation to offshore areas very differently. And in Germany, they have the scientific advisors have been arguing that, well, any seamount or anything leveling off of the sea bottom creates good conditions for marine life. So they have been interpreting it. They've been developing they started out developing their own national definition where there were no lower depth limits, which they were operating with. And the UK, they were more on the original definition. And this created a lot of tension. That different member states have different interpretations of it. And there were discussions about whether by, for example, removing the lower depth limit, they were extending changing the habitat. They were adding a new habitat type to the directive, which was, So, yeah.
But did this have implications in terms, I'm referring, for example, to some of the stakeholders, let's take the fisheries as one particular example. Let's say that the credibility of the court case, which you so like it, was seen as being low.
I haven't been, the Greenpeace judgment.
Yeah, whether it's the Greenpeace court case in UK or whether it's a European. Germany, it's formally the European case, but the European court case is really an echo of the UK case. So I don't see much of a difference.
But this transition, well, that there has, many of, particularly the fishers, have been quite ironic about this transition, this transformation. It is an extension of the Habitats Directive to the marine area, and some of them have argued that a sandbank in the coastal area is something completely different from in offshore areas. which also means that they think this whole exercise of designating sites in the middle of the North Sea is nonsense. And that is not just fishes, it's also some of the scientific advisors who have difficulties in seeing the meaning in this. Some of the scientific advisors in the UK think that these processes of designating sandbanks in the middle of the marine area is taking their time from conserving biological diversity. So, there's been a lot of debate about the meaningfulness.
But in what is concluded, you see a historical perspective on the Habitats Directive, on the process before, let's say, your data starts.
Yeah, which affects, of course, their perspectives in the actions I've been talking about.
I have a small question in relation to the habitat, and that is, how did the word or the notion slightly covered sneak its way into the habitat, the directive?
Yeah.
If it's all this science hype.
Yeah. Yes. It's been really difficult for me to trace the history of the early history of how this habitats hype was entered the directive. I've actually been looking for documents. Somebody told me that there is kind of a Bible for each directive showing what each member state has been saying and making a process and so on. I haven't been able to get hold of anything. So all I have is what the informants have told me about these processes, and luckily I've been talking to one who was there when they added the sandbanks to the list, to the annex. And what he said was just that they were talking about this that there were some important birds habitats along the German coast, which they wanted to protect. So slightly, perhaps because you could argue that when it's in coastal areas, maybe it is slightly handled. But there are a lot of inconsistencies there. Also, I mean, the original definition also says that it's a resting place for seals, but if it's always submerged, then it can't be a resting place for seals. So that's also, but it might be because they thought of it as a habitat for diving seabirds, because there are limits to how deep they can dive, and it is about some of the folks told me 20 meters. So it might have been because they thought of it as habitats.
That's certainly the impression one gets
Yes.
from reading up on your history.
Yeah.
Which I suppose is, I think your main source is the UK scientific advisor. So that's his perspective you are taking.
Yes, exactly. It's from informants and from what they remember.
Hey.
Yeah. Should we go over to the German papers, the history and the institutional topic?
I'm wondering where I've got a question about the Northumbrian words.
Oh, you better do that.
Yeah.
You've spent, this relates to the policy role question and then the boundary definition processes, Ditte, that you've described in the German and UK processes for site designation. The way that you've referred to the Mertonian norms of science, communalism, disinterestedness, universalism, organized skepticism, or originality and skepticism, as that was more lately formulated.
Yeah.
So the 4 or 5 norms which are thought to be special to science in terms of its generation of reliable public knowledge. It was a bit confusing to me at times how you were actually referring to this, and I think there's something which we said in the report which we can probably pass over for the moment about the methods which Merton used.
Yes.
And what status this gave to what he saw as an account of, as it were, a realistic account of science.
Yes.
And so then there's the further observation that maybe this kind of model of science, as many sociologists in the 70s looking at scientific practices, they often found that these norms were actually very frequently contravened, even although they did play a very important role in science, but more as a kind of ideal heuristic.
Yeah.
Something that scientists should strive for, but that they wouldn't necessarily ever achieve fully. A case maybe of slight submergence.
Yeah.
Most of the time.
Yeah.
Slightly
Yeah. But there's another question about this, which if I could get you to turn to the thesis again, it's on page 177. Yeah. And I'll just quote it, so again everyone here can hear what I'm referring to. As a wide range of case studies have shown, Mertonian norms, these kudos norms I've just mentioned, organise scientific advisory processes, also where they are not explicitly formulated as a legal obligation, as they are, for example, in the Habitats Directive and the designation of sites. Mertonian norms organise scientific advisory processes. That suggests that the Mertonian norms do indeed operate as norms which are reflected in real practice all the time. And I was, in fact, I did insert in my note on your thesis there, Mertonian norms organise accounts of scientific advisory processes, which is actually what Merton did. He listened to scientists' accounts of their processes of scientific knowledge making, not advice, but we'll come to that in a few minutes. But those accounts were themselves those given by scientists of their own practice, and not actually their practicing.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering whether, is there actually a confusion there as to whether we're talking about the Mertonian norms as organising scientific practices or organising public accounts of scientific practices for public authority making, or attempts at public authority making?
Yeah. Well, there's certainly, the Mertonian norms were open to develop these norms, not on the basis of studies of scientific practice. You interview scientists about their ideas about what is it that constitutes valid science and how should scientists and so on. And that's what he's been criticized for as well, that he didn't look actually at practice. And when I talk about that Mertonian norms organize scientific advisory processes, it's certainly not because I mean that they are organized according to in that way. But as I've also shown in the document processes, perhaps it's not Mertonian norms, but it's ideas about, has also writing and changed that in my presentation, it's some kind of commonplace understanding of science, which might be affected by Mertonian norms, but it's more relevant to talk about that. But the idea of science as ideally detached and sometimes as in practice detached from interest and so on, has agency in these practices, and if they organize the practices. There's an example, for example, where Hildegard has shown how the staging of a number of advisory reports on health and diet in the States, how they have been staged by how they have procedures for ensuring that the members of the committees make the assessments, that they're not lived up with interest rate and so on. There are a lot of procedures in order to manage the processes. So it's the notion or the ideal of science as disinterested, which has agency in that way organizes.
But there's also another part to that, which the Hildegard example shows very well. And other cases do as well. I think you could say that your cases do, even if it wasn't a dimension that you really emphasised, which is that scientists are always operating in their negotiation of what counts and what counts as scientific, etc.
Yeah.
They're always operating with an implicit idea of an audience, which is part of the authority thing. These scientific knowledges have to have public authority, and so there's always a sense of, well, who is the audience that we're actually attempting to persuade or have credibility and authority in? And I think it would be interesting to develop that further actually in your UK and German case studies.
In relation to, you want me to elaborate on that? Yes. In the UK, I think that the scientific advisors have mainly been concerned about the responses of the government.
Yeah.
They are a really important stakeholder here, and they have mainly been working hard to provide advice that will be accepted by government. And I think other stakeholders have played a very good role in this. But because of this claim in the Habitat Directive to produce boundaries that are exclusively based on science, they have also been aware that environmental NGOs might take them to court. They might face an infraction at the European Court. And environmental NGOs have been ordering legal advice and sending the advice to the statutory advisors just to show that we're working on this. So they have been very alert about staging their advice as disinterested. In Germany, I've been treating the cases very unevenly, because I haven't told that I entered the processes at very different times, stages of the process. Germany had already finished this long time ago, and in the UK they were still working to designate boundaries, and it was still highly controversial. So I had a chance to follow the consultation process there, and I did it in Germany. I got a lot of consultation responses in German, which I looked at with my German skills. Yes.
So just before we do that, I do have a little comment on the German discussion we just had. You are treating very much science almost as a black box, and I think particularly in the German discussion, it's quite important to try to distinguish the various roles of the scientists. Let me just offer you three categories without having thought much about them. that you could say that you have a scientist in the laboratory. You are giving quite a detailed account on the application of the TIN model or other models, which is setting up a computer program and later run close your eyes and look at it. What you perhaps might have reflected on here is that the outcome of the TIN model is not what it's used. When you look at the map, you have drawn some straight lines, which must necessarily mean that some interpolation of some form has been used. But that's one where I think the Newtonian norms are quite important, if only as ideals. Then you have the advisory scientist, who is more or less a civil servant, trying to help with political masters to make sense out of their things and not making utterly nonsense. And then you have the third one, which is the scientist as part of the public debate, where you have in the entire process we're dealing, of which you're only dealing with one element of it, the designation of it, just for the organism. The full process, I think, Ditte actually into is the first. You have to review all the sandbanks. You have to find out where do we have sandbanks of the 1110 type. Then you have to look on which data you have, what do you know about these sandbanks. Someone have to make a decision that, in your case for the German, you have decided for the total area only to nominate 60% of the sandbanks, which is, if nothing else, a clear non-scientific decision. There might be additional monitoring and so on, but there is a decision to be made here. But once you have done that, there is a public hearing, which you invert, and then you have a designation, the proposed saying. And then the next part of the process is the one which your German colleague refers to the definition of the management. So we are only dealing with one particular element of the full process. We have now looked at all the sandbanks to a piece of legal text approved by national parliament saying you are not allowed to do sand and gravel extraction on these areas, for example. And I think that we have to be very clear on where we are in the process here. And this comes particularly back to the discussion of science uncertainty. We are just looking on, or you're just looking on the designation process, not the subsequent, and a little bit not the first where you don't describe that someone had looked on CMAP and said, this is why we have them. So perhaps you would like a little bit to reflect on where the Newtonian norms comes in this bigotry or frigatory, I suppose it would be, with the scientists in the laboratory, with scientists, there's an advisory role, civil servant and scientists in the public debate.
The last it's just to understand when you talk about different roles of scientists.
Yes,
and then you talk about this that I focused on arrangement part of the process.
My key point is that we are looking on, to me, science has several steps. I'm just offering three.
Yeah.
As you have seen when you are discussing sediments, we can have 3 classes or we can have 200 classes. We can, of course, I'm just offering 3 for the sake of the argument. And the key point is, where do the Newtonian norms comes in? in each of these, again remembering that we are only looking on the designation part here and not a lot of the other parts, in particular defined in the management issues.
Yeah. I'll try to, well, I mean, I think the notion of science as ideally disinterested, I think that's an underlying idea which I'm sure affects all kinds of processes. It's not like they come at some particular point. But what I had to refer to is that in this process, designation process, they are supposed to base their designation of sites exclusively on science, but they can choose. They only have to. They have to find out how many square kilometers of sand they have, and then they have, out of these square kilometers, they have to designate between 20 and 60% of these habitats, and they can choose. I mean, they can. It's actually illegal to base these decisions on also on politics. Is that what you're?
Yeah, it's really in your presentation. Who are they?
Yeah.
They can choose, you said. Who are the one to choose?
That's it depends on whether you're looking at the UK or Germany, for example. It depends on the division of work between the statutory advisors and the government. In Germany, the scientific advisors, they have defined quite a lot of in these processes as something that belongs to the role of scientists. Whereas in the UK, they have been negotiating much more with government. Government have had their say, but they have not, I mean, because you're supposed to designate between 20 and 60%, but you can't just, I mean, you also have to have the main variations within that habitat type covered, and you have to be able to justify in some way that you choose the particular habitats that you do, and Dr. Bank has been the scientific advisors in the UK, for example, we have argued that there's no question that we can not designate sites on the Dr. Bank from a scientific viewpoint.
No.
I don't know if I'm.
Yeah.
But if you were to expand your analysis on the two cases, on Germany and on the UK, so as to contextualize it a little bit more and give us, the readers, a stronger understanding for the different takes in the two countries.
The UK process, I mean, with the focus on transparency and on public communication, on receptiveness to government and so on, has a history, and it's related among particularly to particular cases. One was the mad cow disease in the UK during the beginning of the 1990s. There was a spread of the mad cow disease in British cattle, and there were concerns about whether this could be connected to a spread in humans of the Jacob's syndrome, and government went out on the basis of scientific advice, and also at one particular scientific advice, and said that you shouldn't be concerned. There's no connection. You can safely eat this meat. And then later, in 1997, they again, the government stated publicly that it is highly probable that is a connection there. And this incident created a need for and requests for new procedures in relation to scientific advice. A report was written. Where they stressed the need for science to be more, that scientific advice to be more transparent, to be more engaged in public communication and so on, so that the public would have a chance also to consider the risk and the advice. Germany, I can't say much about that, unfortunately, only except that I've heard from others that this is, I recognize the style in German scientific
advice. Let me start there. The German case is so rich that they were forced to write a book. You're quoting that from 2006.
Yeah.
And I'm just putting that to yeah, who coming?
They can't.
Oh, they can't!
We're locked in here.
I think that's a little bit unfair. At the very least, Ditte should have a chance of running away. Anyway, the rock is on our side. Anyway, to come back to did I lose my own phrase? I probably did. But anyway, I was coming to that the Germans apparently have had a need to, let's say, sell a particular version of the process. The book, to me, is very much edited to a particular need. And my first question to you, have talked to these people, would then be on to what extent you feel this is a filtered story or a edited story, or whether you would agree, disagree, that we are here faced with something which people have thought about how to present rather than how it happened.
Yeah, I really think that they thought hard about how to present their methodological approach, and I also found that they thought hard about it when I interviewed them. It was both in the reports, both in the particular report on the Dogger Bank and in this book that you're referring to, and also in interviews they talked a lot about how they had their methodology had ensured that there was as little personal judgment involved as possible in their designation of the boundaries. And I have been wondering why they have been so concerned about that, why it took up so much space and so on. And unfortunately, I can't. That's what's one of the issues when coming into this late in the process, is that I'm not there when all the controversies are open and so on. So much of this has happened, and it's been difficult to get into it. But they have been designating these areas. It's been a really fast process. It took 2 years, and they have been very, they have not been receptive to governments in relation to in relation to the comments they got. They did get some comments, and they have been insisting on this need to postpone considering the socioeconomic implications to the management process. And I think they are facing a lot of problems now while they are developing management plans for the sites. Because the sites are designated, they have to protect them in some way, and they have to justify the management measures that they make for the European Commission. So I think that this really fast process in the beginning has meant that they are dealing with some problems now, which might give them need to return to the basis for this designation and justify it in some way. That's
just for the audience, purely facts. They designated in 2004.
yeah.
They haven't completed the process on defining management measures. UK started, was that in 2008 or something like that? 2000.
They started
six perhaps.
So
They are at exactly the same point in the process today as where Germany is. The only one who have done it very cleverly is always Denmark. They didn't designate it. No problem.
I have no problems.
But that was a little bit of the line there. You're not talking about really on the what is normally called advocacy science. The German group here and the UK group, of course, are doing this like anybody else and have their preferences and what do you call it? And sorry, but how much do you think that played a role in this process?
I think that in Germany, they definitely, the scientific advisors have had a green agenda. And that's also how other actors I've been talking with have been referring to it. Both fishes, industry representatives and environmental NGOs, and also scientific advisors in the UK have talked about how they have had green agendas in this regard. And I'm sure that's also affected the process and affected the way that they've been managing the boundaries between science and politics, that they have been managing it so that they could enforce. I mean, they went for the 60% of the habitats, and they went for defining the sandbanks as, you know, they didn't want any lower depth limit and so on. They argued for this in a scientific way, and that way they could keep the power to define the sandbank on their side of the boundary. But I definitely think they have a green agenda.
Why do you think that they could keep the power to describe to run the process? Obviously, somewhere there's a minister sitting who could say I want some other institute to do it, or I want a third opinion by some university.
There was a Green government at the time. I mean, they started, the process was from 2002 to 2004, and there was a Green government. Some also have argued that they were so fast because they wanted to do it before the election, which was in 2004. So I think they have really used an opportunity.
I'm just really wanting to try and fill out these comparative dimensions a little bit more in connection with the bank designation processes, but also bearing in mind other cases where these kind of contextual factors indicate differences in the processes between UK and Germany. So I think what you've described there and your way of explaining those differences is fine as far as it goes, but I'm not sure it goes far enough. So just for example, actually the BSE case in the UK that you quite rightly described as being very formative, the inquiry, the official judicial inquiry that took place into it by Lord Phillips in 2000, and the very strong policy recommendations which he made concerning transparency of scientific advice, etc., and the inclusiveness as well. The highly selective nature of British scientific advice in all kinds of different areas, including BSE, has been very striking. It's been analysed comparatively between US, UK, comparisons UK, Germany as well in other contexts. Sheila Jasanoff, for example, in the biotech book Designs on Nature, 2005. In that case, in 1989, when the observations about an epidemic of mad cow disease in British cattle, dairy cattle mainly, were just becoming established, the government set up an ad hoc scientific advisory committee chaired by Richard Southwood, a very eminent biochemist. And the Southwood committee analysed the situation, analysed the possible causes, analyse the possible consequences in terms of things like what's the risk of human transmission of this, and therefore human risk. And they came up with certain recommendations, particularly about separating the risky tissue, like central nervous system, brain tissue, etc., from the meat tissues which were actually mainly used for human consumption, so muscle tissue, etc. And the recommendations were completely impracticable. So, for example, every slaughterhouse was supposed to actually cleanly separate all of the, what was it called, specifically at-risk tissue, or words to that effect, like spinal cord, like nervous tissue, right through the body, from anything which is going to go for human consumption to butchers, etc., etc. Environmental health officers and inspectors found that some of these slaughterhouses were actually working on what's called piece rates. In other words, the workers are operating on conditions of pay where they were paid more for actually more production of meat for sale, etc. They were using chainsaws to cut up calves. A really precise way of separating the risky tissue from the non-risky tissue or the less risky tissue. So these observations were made and they were ignored. And the Southwood Committee actually did consider this. It was asked of the committee at the time, why did it, in its expert recommendations, independent scientific advice to government, this is called, Mertonian, etc., disinterested, not influenced by politics at all. But in the processes of informal consultation, just the kind that you described in the Dogger Bank case, with the JNCC, etc., in the BSE case, the Southwood Committee, Southwood as chair, was continually consulting with government officials and policymakers. And one of the issues, one of the possible options which was on their plate as scientific advisors was cull the whole of the British dairy cattle herd. Every single calf, cull them all, and then start again. Maybe that would actually rid the British population of BSc. Maybe not, but at least it was a start. That was considered by the Southwood Committee in private. And when Southwood was asked, why didn't you have anything about that in your report? And the answer was, because we knew that ministers would not even remotely consider that. It was just a completely unrealistic thing to consider economically and politically. So we didn't write it in our report. So there is independent scientific advice, independent individual policy. It's already been influenced by knowledge of what the policy process is going to accept. So this is co-production at work, between science and policy.
Yeah.
And so often, even without that interaction, the scientists are attempting to second guess, to understand what will the policymakers accept or not. They're already doing that, whether or not they're speaking to the policymakers, it doesn't matter. They're still already imagining that and trying to work it out. And they're intelligent, they've been around the political system a bit, so they make their best efforts. That's co-production as well, and it's unstated. And this is where policy is already influencing the so-called independent science before it arrives on the minister's desk as the official advice of this or that or the other committee, including JNCC. So what you're describing there is actually a very typical British situation, where there is, you could say, very pragmatic, very flexible interaction going on to try to tune the science to what is realistic in the world of policy, politics, economics and everything else. And sometimes that goes wildly wrong, as it did in the BSc case. Sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it adjusts, it makes sense. And perhaps, as I think Hans is indicating, when the British policy system arrives at a decision, the implementability of that decision is already partly prepared. Because there's been a lot of interaction going on already about, is this realistic? Can we implement this or not? Is it practical? It's already been going on in a way that isn't necessarily true in the German situation. Jasnoff describes this. And these are some of the very interesting, historically entrenched, institutional, cultural conditions which differ between different member states of the EU. And I dare say we could describe a different kind of system for Denmark. Parts of which might be repeated in Britain, parts of which in Germany, maybe, who knows. But the point is that these are important contextual factors when it comes to understanding why it was that Britain arrived at this designation and then arrived at that one, and there was different dates and speeds, etc., etc. So I was just trying to describe there something about that process. But I've got a question for you on that, and this is another contextual factor which may be relevant, I don't know, but it has been in other cases which are documented and in the literature. So, for example, each different member state of the EU, and the US, again, a separate sovereign nation, national policy system, historically, different particular disciplinary groups of experts may have become institutionalized as the advisory authorities on whichever issue it might be, air pollution, marine pollution, Habitats Directive, whatever else it might be, nature conservation. So it might be, for example, in the case of GMOs, it might be mainly molecular biologists with a handful of ecologists. Or it might be, imaginably, mainly ecologists with a handful of molecular biologists. That radically influences the evidence selection for the advisory process, the interpretive commitments, the framings, etc., etc., the synaptic characters. Doesn't mean that any of it's corrupt or biased, but it's already got disciplinary cultural characteristics. Now, if, for example, historically it's been the case that a particular disciplinary culture of that kind has gained authority in the German system as the scientific advice, and in Britain it's been a different disciplinary community, then you might well end up with different scientific advice when actually science is supposed to be universal, independent, singular, etc. So you didn't describe or raise questions about any of that in your thesis on the Dogger Bank. And I don't know whether it's relevant because I'm not familiar in detail with the case. But I'm just inviting you to reflect on that and give us your thoughts as to whether that may have been a relevant consideration in the differences which you've described between the UK and Germany?
I mean, what occurred to me was mainly that the disciplinary approaches were chosen for some of the reasons which I've described. And for example, in the UK, they started out basing their designation on the same approach as in Germany. They referred to the German paper and so on. Germany, they described their own process as a pilot project, which they suggested that other member states should follow, and some are irrelevant about that. But at least the scientific advisors have been really based it on the same approach. So it was the Department for Energy and Climate Change who requested biological data, and who didn't find that this approach underpinned the boundaries properly, and they did so because of the policy objectives, the need to protect biological diversity. So then they added, they also supplemented with the study of subgeological, of the subgeology on the bank. And I was puzzled as to why. What does that tell about the Dogger Bank as a habitat? And they said, well, they want some more underpinning. They want some more data. And when we sent out this, and it's really difficult to send out these survey ships. So we always group surveys together, and we had on board some who were doing this for some other purpose. We could just as well use their data. Now it was there anyway. So they used it to kind of underpin the boundaries a bit more. So in this way, different disciplines came in, some by accident. I think the first this slope analysis, that was copying Germany, and then the biological approach came in on a request from government. I don't know about the German, because much of what I can tell about the German process is based on their own description of their processes, and much looking back. So all these kind of details, I haven't been able to do much into that.
I just would make the observation that I suspect that if one was able to do that with a real historical kind of sensibility and method, that you might well find some very interesting things analytically in terms of the comparative processes and outcomes as well, perhaps, between the two cases.
I think you're right, because it means a lot.
Yeah, just more or less, there's a final comment. And there's one parameter which you cannot discuss given your cases, which is the scale of the operation. You are dealing with large countries, both of them with fairly large institutions and so on. If you were, and let's just do the extreme, go to Greenland or the Faroe Islands, who both have authority over their own, he said, I'm quite sure you will find some different processes. I have different areas. So this is really just a comment in relation to that if you were to enlarge, let's say, the theory or so, I would definitely suggest that you take it on the scale. A society with, in Greenland, let's say 50,000-60,000, Faroe Islands, a few thousand less, has a very, very different situation, and any sort of ideas on, let's say, disinterested people simply do not exist. Either they are interested or they are incompetent. in such a small situation, either you are involved and you are involved on many dimensions and you are competent, or you are incompetent and nothing. That would be my theory. That was just a comment. My final question is, we have just had a case in Italy on an earthquake prediction. Is that on an earthquake prediction where you took the scientists to court and they didn't predict the earthquake, which obviously had rather disastrous results, so we give them, I forgot whether it was 6 years in jail. Is that the kind of accountability you are arguing for?
No, I think that it's an interesting case. They have been convicted now. I think that really it tells something about the expectations we have to science as a basis, a solid basis for decision making. I mean, it's really a responsibility to place on science to be able to in that way underpin political decision making. Which is also what we see in the Habitats Directive, this expectation that if you just define boundaries on science alone, and it's certainly not accountability.
Thank you.
A big sigh of relief, I think. That.
Who knows who would go to jail in this room?
I have a few collapses on my conscious. Okay.
I get to give you the last question.
Yes.
And you're almost there. We have 50 others, but we'll let them know. The question is simply, what surprised you the most in your study?
Actually, what surprised me, which is surprising, because because I'm trying to study how science policy boundary management is diffuse and can take on a lot of different shapes. But I was really surprised about how the UK scientific advisors, how little they were preoccupied with convincing me that they had not been influenced by government when they made decisions. They were very little preoccupied with that, and they told them, of course, we negotiated, and of course, it has implications, and it also means that we have to consider their benefits and so on. So, it surprised me that it was.
Then I have to have another question. Do you think that would have been the same if you had talked to more policymakers? I mean, in this managing the boundary, you're kind of one-sided.
Yes.
You're only on the side of the scientific advisors and a couple of the stakeholders.
Yes.
What about the other side and how they look at it?
It would have been really interesting to talk with the policymakers, and also because I approached this process of of managing boundaries between science and politics as, I can argue that they mutually shape each other, they co-develop. So just looking at the science in this process of managing boundaries is, you're right, to focus on a very narrow focus. I have tried to get in contact with policymakers in the UK, and for some reason it was really difficult. Just it was also possible to get when any of the wind farm developers. Perhaps because it was Dogger Bank was really a tense issue. There was a long period where nobody would tell me anything about Dogger Bank, and one of my informants said, "Don't ask me about the Dogger Bank." And I had to postpone interviewing for a year. I think it's just a really tense issue, and it was really unfortunate that I didn't get to talk to policymakers, which of course could also have been private, but I have elaborated a bit on the implications of that in the presentation. The German policymakers, there's an issue again there with that I entered the process that way, and that this happened between 2002 and 2004. Yeah, so that's okay. Yeah.
Anything? What? All right.
Okay. And then I said that there's open for questions from the audience, and actually nobody approached me during the pause. I don't know, I was running a bit. Somebody didn't catch me, or that's because you don't want to put a question. I will, with your acceptance, open for if some of you during this discussion have thought of a question that you would like to put to Ditte. Okay. Then I will say thank you, and then we will end this debate, and the assessment committee can go for themselves to discuss and assess. And there will be the reception. I think it's just outside here, and I know there's something for us now. So let's go out there and wait for the committee. Yes, good. How do you win it? Hvis du smager til meget jo. Det er spændende at se.
Den havde tid til de første til præsentationen lige præcis, men ikke mere end det.
Okay, jo. Så er den i hvert fald.
Men altså den her har også en rekordfunktion og er ved at recorde nu. Og jeg ved ikke om det virker, at man så kan komme til at downloade det, man har recordet med det her.
Og det vil jo være
det får vi se. Men det var ikke så længe.
Så Det er sikkert noget andet.
Det tror jeg også.
Men jeg elsker det jo så.
Det er det.
Men at du ikke har fortalt historien på den måten som den gjerne vil ha.
Because that may be we were just talking about how you were feeling.
Det er det første, man er bedre. Uttalelsen av det.